you ever told the truth and been called dangerous? Welcome back to Auntea-ology, the Antidote Dialogues. I'm Mueni Mutinda.
And I'm Sobia, Ali-Faisal.
Last time, we asked if you were the drama. This time, we're asking what happens when you stop performing peace and start speaking truth. Sobia, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. I'm excited about today's conversation. A little nervous, but definitely looking forward to this. This is something I've been thinking about for a really long time. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing well. Thanks. I'm doing very well. It's raining, so definitely enjoying the tea and this conversation. I'm looking forward to this conversation. And the topic, as you say, it is a sensitive one. So I'm bringing in that tea closer. Okay, so tea's ready. Let's talk about the last time you told the truth and they called you dangerous.
Okay, so I have a story about that. This past year, I watched something a little unsettling happen. So Zoran Mamdani ran for mayor of New York City. For those who don't know, he's a 34-year-old Muslim man, democratic socialist, and he came out of nowhere and won the mayorship of New York City. He's also unapologetically anti-Zionist. And because of that, the smear campaigns against him were relentless. Anti-Muslim racism, fear-mongering, hate. They called him a threat. They said Jews would not be safe with him in power. They acted like a Muslim in power was a dangerous thing. Luckily, he won anyway, and by all accounts is doing an amazing job right now. Very popular. But watching all that panic reminded me of something that I'd recently experienced. When I was working at UPEI recently, as staff, the Faculty Association filed an informal complaint about my personal social media posts. So these are posts that I made outside of work hours, on my own time, using my personal social media accounts, which did not name my employer. Specifically, they were upset about my anti-Zionist and anti-casteist posts that I reshared from others, from scholars specifically. Now, I'm South Asian. I'm against caste-based discrimination, which is rampant in our communities. So this is something I often post about. And also, I'm Muslim. Zionism has been at the forefront of perpetuating and propagating anti-Muslim racism. So this is also something I post a lot about. Both Zionism and casteism impact me personally. The Faculty Association said that I was biased. You know, like how we're accused of being biased against white people when we call that racism? They even asked that I be removed from equity work with them. That's how offended they were with my honesty about the brutality and oppression of both Zionism and casteism. After about a month, the university fired me. No clear reason, no warning, no due process. Just a less than 1 minute conversation with my boss, who said they were letting me go for some vague reason that didn't make any sense to me. Then later that same day, they sent an email statement out to the campus community about workplace culture concerns. And they suggested that the campus was safer without me. So here I am, a Muslim woman who does equity work, who speaks about Palestine and anti-Muslim racism and casteism, and who refuses to be neutral about genocide. And that makes me a threat to them. And so, unfortunately, here's the lesson that I've learned from that hate and fear don't want truth. What they need is a story to keep that hate and the fear going. The story of the dangerous Muslim has been circulating for centuries. It makes people panic about Zoran Mamdani leading New York, and it made UPEI remove me without dignity, without reason, without a single conversation as to why, or an opportunity for me to defend my truth. So here's the thing. Radical honesty will cost you. There's really no way around that. The systems of oppression that we are working to dismantle are built upon lies, layers and layers of lies. Lies about Black, Brown, and Indigenous people, lies about disabled and queer people, lies about immigrants, lies about poor people, lies about women, lies about the other, basically. But the alternative to radical honesty is silence. And silence protects these systems, not people. And the more people who are honest, the harder it becomes to silence us all.
Sobia, first, thank you for sharing that story. I'm sorry that that happened to you. What I'm hearing is that radical honesty isn't about being authentic in some feel-good way. It's about the fact that silence protects systems, not people, and the alternative to honesty isn't safety, it's complicity. And one of the things that strikes me about your story is that the university didn't even try to make the case against you, your substance. They just couldn't argue with what you actually said, so they made it about you, about who you are. And it strikes me that that's how power protects itself when it can't win on logic.
Exactly. I mean, power is based on lies, right? Truth telling challenges its existence. So the truth telling is very threatening to power. They need to maintain a certain status quo, and anyone who threatens that through truth telling is going to be considered a threat. Because again, it's like lies upon lies upon lies. One example that I think of that always helps me understand this better, and it maybe might help listeners understand as well, is the interview that I heard a few years ago. So Mark Lamont Hill interviewed a forensic psychiatrist named Dr. Aruna Kilanani. She is of South Asian descent, works in the US, and there was some sort of controversy around something she had said at the time, and it had to do with race and racism. So in the interview, Hill asked her basically, based on your expertise, are white people psychopathic? Again, she's a psychiatrist, and this is her area of expertise. And she said, yes, she thinks so. And not because every white person has a clinical disorder. Like, that's not what she was suggesting. But because of the scale of lying that has been normalized since colonization, right? There's just so many lies that these systems have been built on this idea of white supremacy, ideas of like the supremacy of the colonizers. It's all been based on lies. And so Hill asked her for an example, like, what did she mean? And she said, well, like you steal a country, you loot the country, you genocide the people there, the indigenous people there, and then you say you discovered it. Like, that's not discovery. But you say you discovered it, and then you write that in history books, and that's taught in schools, and it's taught in institutions. And all of a sudden, it's a quote unquote fact of history, right? It becomes so normalized. These lies become so normalized. And so her point was that as long as white people are unwilling to recognize those lies, as long as they walk around with this sort of psychopathic understanding of the world where theft becomes discovery and genocide becomes settlement, you can't address racism because you can't solve a problem that you refuse to name honestly. And so these are the types of lies that these systems are based on. And until we are willing, to recognize these lies, we're not going to be able to address any of these systems of oppression.
It reminds me of the doctrine of discovery. I don't know. Have you looked at that document? Have you read it? Yeah. And the first time I read it, and I mean, I think every time I have read it since that time, it's always struck me how kind of the push or the direction was to subdue, quote unquote, like you're discovering these lands don't have people, which then they are yours to take. And if there are any humans, indigenous people that are there, which were considered not human, less than human, they are going to serve you in perpetuity. And so the construct, the colonial construct is that there's this lie, this decision that is made that then is continued on and built upon, which then we see in our modern day, these institutions that continue to harm, that continue to smear the identities of people, and particularly Black and Brown, Indigenous, 2S LGBTQ people with disabilities. It's people that have been put on the margins of society by those lies that are then vilified and harmed continuously because they are being looked at through another lens. And that is a system. That's a sickness.
Hmm. It reminds me of Adrienne Marie Brown's her when she talks about radical imagination, and she says, people say to her, "Well, aren't you too like idealistic?" And she said, "Well, right now the world we live in was like the fantasy and of the colonizers, right? Like the world we live in is a fantasy of the capitalists. Like this is how they imagined. This is their imagination. They imagined it, and then they did what they did to make it real. So we live in their imagination. Why can't we imagine better? Why can't we work towards our imagination and what we want? So we live in their life, in the world that they've imagined, in which like Black, Brown, and Indigenous people are dangerous and need to be controlled and need to be subdued. These are all lies that they've created, and yet these have become our reality. So why can't we then create a world that is one in which we're liberated?
Yeah, so refuse the reality of this one, which was imagined and created against our will, and dare to create something else. You mentioned that there's a choice. There's always a choice. There's an option to truth tell, but the practice and the choice, taking that choice to truth tell, is sometimes not so easy because of the cost that it means. And maybe some just don't want to bear that cost. Maybe the dream sounds good, but there seems to be a disconnect that I want the temporary promises of the context, the systems that I'm a part of now. I know those are not enough, but I want another dream, but I am not willing to make the sacrifice to let what I know go for an unknown.
Truth telling is scary. It is like, and if you look at history, right? I mean, a lot of truth tellers were punished, some by death. This isn't like this, that's not unusual, right? I get that truth telling is scary. And I think we do need to acknowledge that is the reality of the world. And that's because the systems don't want us to tell the truth. We look at, if you look at people like Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and other folks in the Black radical tradition who have been killed by the state for their truth telling. So yeah, it's scary. And granted, for the most of us, we're not facing that kind of a threat for truth telling. It might be potentially losing your job, losing friends, losing relationship. And so I understand, but what is the cost of silence? That silence, if you're going to be silent, what is that cost though? Like we're the point that we are in history right now, we are seeing the cost. We are seeing the cost. Like we're seeing into our neighbors to the south, the fascism that's been rising, that's there. That is the cost of not telling the truth. The costs are so high of not telling the truth to us. Like we think that yes, individually this will harm us if we tell the truth, but that's why it's so important for so many of us to do it together. There's power in numbers, right? I mean, over the last couple of years, I have seen so many more people tell the truth about what's happening to Palestinians. And now it's become so normalized, to be open and honest about that. And that has led to truth telling in so many other spaces too. It hasn't been limited to just what's happening to Palestinians. People are starting to see the truth of how all these systems of oppression are interconnected. And people's eyes have been opened and people are much more willing to speak out now. And I think this is a moment where we are starting to see some major changes, and moving forward, there's going to be major changes because so many people are now willing to speak the truth. And I think that if those who are listening are still scared, I mean, I get it, but you have to ask yourself the question, like, what is the cost of that? What is the cost of your silence? And are you actually an honest person? Right? I mean, I go back to Dr. Aruna Kilanani's commentary, and I think her challenge to us is that if you benefit from a system that's built on a lie and you never say the lie out loud, are you actually an honest person? And I think that goes back to her answer to Mark Lamont Hill's question on, are white people psychopathic? Well, if you're not actually calling out the lies, and if you're benefiting from the lies, then what does that say about you as an individual, right? And I think people need to sit with that and understand, what does that mean for them? Are
Hmm.
you just a well-adjusted participant in a very old delusion? And what does that say about you? And how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of one of the things that I have learned over the years in the nonprofit sector and have instituted into just the way I approach. Maybe it's something new or a decision I have to make or a group that I've just joined that I don't know the people and so on. And so I'm being asked to do something, to bring something. I like to consider how I'm coming into that space. So, in other words, my positionality when it comes to all the things that have contributed to make me me, my culture, my history, my politics, my identities, intersecting identities, my education, my worldviews, my religious views, my relations, my family. So, all of those things contribute to position me in a certain way in this group or in this space that I am taking up. And if I'm unconscious of how I'm showing up, more often than not, I will cause harm, which can be prevented if I did that work on becoming conscious of, wait, I've got these privileges and these benefits. How am I ensuring that I am doing right by them and that I'm using them in a way that is responsible and contributing to community well-being? Because we're not islands. We are relational. And I think you and I have talked, one of the antidotes to, truth telling and this idea of being vilified for telling the truth, especially to systems, speaking out against systemic oppression equals the ostracization of you, which can mean like economically there's a disadvantage, and especially if you are from historically minoritized community groups. So how do we maintain that I need to be self-aware to see that I have a responsibility? We talk about relational accountability and that I have a role to play in how things unfold in the future. I am not responsible for what happened in the past. That's true. I mean, all kinds of things have happened before we got here. But the thing is, we've been here now for a time and things have happened that we have been complicit to. And so what happens next? We can't be like ostriches that just bury their head under the sand and pretend, well, I can't see it. I don't know, therefore it's not happening.
And understanding your own fears as well. Like, what are you scared of? What are your insecurities? What are your concerns about your safety? And how did this play into like whether or not you're willing to speak truth or not? Is that part of the equation? Are you really unsafe or uncomfortable? And I think that's a really important question for a lot of folks to look at.
From a human perspective, we seem preoccupied with truth telling and being honest. That's a value. We want to have the truth told to us just as much as we want to be truth tellers. But in reality or in practice, it's like we're not reaching that because of multiple things. You mentioned fear, you mentioned, the cost of not speaking out. One of the costs of silence is that it's different for different bodies. So it's not the same across the board. And actually your story shows that some of us are already read as dangerous before we open our mouths. So for somebody who can just decide, I'm going to be silent, I'm going to opt out, that is even a position of privilege to be able to say, I don't have to engage in this conversation and still benefit for their silence. While the ones who speak out or the ones that are silenced still continue to face forms of violence.
Absolutely. I mean, I think about my own experience at UPEI, and I know that even if I had not been let go, eventually I know I would have been told, like, I'm sure I would have been told to not post about the things that I was posting about. Again, on my personal social media, I know I would have been told to not post about things that are relevant to me. Like when I post about Zionism or casteism, I'm speaking about things that impact me. I'm speaking about systems of oppression, especially with Zionism. Like I'm speaking about a system of oppression that impacts me, that oppresses me. And for my employer to tell me to be silent on that, to not speak about the oppression of me and my people, to not speak about something that has cost so many Muslim lives. Like it's just, it feels so violent. And if that had been the case and I had stayed and I had been told to be silent and I decided, okay, I have to be silent to keep my job, that would have taken such a massive psychological toll on me. I don't think I would have been able to stay. I would have eventually had to have left anyways, probably, because the idea that I wouldn't be able to post or talk about that in my personal life, just such a violation of my humanity. It's so dehumanizing. And that silence, when some of us who are forced to be silent are basically being forced to dehumanize ourselves. We're basically being told, we don't see you as human and you need to see yourself as like non-human as well. And that's the only way you're going to keep your job. That's the only way you're going to keep this reputation or whatever the case may be. So yeah, that for some of us, that silence is destructive.
Yeah. And it sounds like actually silence is not the safer option. There is no safer option.
Not for many of us, no. For those with privilege, it can be the safer option for them because there's no risk, right? They're fine, they're safe. But for those of us who are marginalized, that silence can mean destruction, literally, right? Whether it's our mental health, physical health, our safety, whatever it might be. But it's very dangerous for us.
I wonder what happens in the mind of the person with a lot of privilege who can, quote unquote, afford to stay silent and benefit from that silence. And what happens to their humanity in terms of they know. I mean, as an adult, there are things that we know intuitively because we've spent this many years on this planet. And so we understand how interactions, specifically human interactions, work. And where we sense disagreement, dishonesty, or willed dishonesty, where we're participating in telling something that is untrue, what does that do to the humanity of the one who decides, yeah, I'm just going to stay silent and put my head down and just coast away. I don't want to ruffle any feathers.
That's a really good question. That's a really good question because I have to think that something happened, right? And that kind of takes me back to what Dr. Kilanani said, is that people are walking around with this delusion. There's a certain almost like psychopathy to it. Like it's not normal. This is not healthy behavior, right? Mentally, psychologically healthy behavior to live in this lie and to believe these types of lies and walk around. So I have to think it has an impact on their own humanity. Like, how are you thinking about other people and what kinds of relationships are you building if you are willing to throw certain people under the bus for your paycheck or whatever the case might be?
Yeah, 100%. And you can never demand truth. For you, it doesn't exist because you don't even model that.
Exactly. And yet they often do demand truth, right? They talk about they value honesty or supposedly value honesty, yet at this most basic human level, they can't honor it.
Yeah. Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada and the work that they've done and the acknowledgement of the atrocities, the harm, the violence, the pillaging of the lands and the peoples and their futures that has happened for Indigenous people on Turtle Island. And this idea of the truth and reconciliation as a foundation for convening necessary conversations that have to happen to acknowledge what's happened in the past so that we can build based on truth and begin to build that trust and relationships that are founded on trust. How do you do that if someone doesn't even acknowledge that this thing has happened?
I mean, there's a reason truth comes before reconciliation, right? Truth and reconciliation. First, you have to tell the truth. And Indigenous folks have told us this already. Like they've said, first, you got to tell the truth. If you're not willing to tell the truth, then there's no moving on to reconciliation. And so many people are so quick to just reconciliation. What are we doing for reconciliation? No, what are you doing to acknowledge the truth? What are you doing to live with the truth? What are you doing to really understand what that means, what the truth means. I mean, the truth is that Canada committed a genocide against Indigenous people. And many Indigenous folks would argue that it continues until today, especially with the ways in which Indigenous children are still taken from their families. So what's Canada doing? I mean, recently an independent international body found Canada guilty of genocide against Indigenous people. And I've seen many people in Canada just deny it, say, oh, this is hyperbolic. This is hyperbole. Now, until we recognize these truths, we're not going to be able to have any reconciliation. Truth is hard to face, but it's necessary. Otherwise, nothing meaningful can come after without that.
And you asked a series of like those really great questions just a few seconds ago, and for me, I'm sitting with, okay, well, how is truth showing up in me? How am I embodying that truth? How am I sitting with that truth and letting that work through me? Where do I need to come clean about some things that are for the well-being of not just me, but the community, the collective? And you're right. Until we do that, we can't reconcile. There's kind of like a stalemate. You can't move forward because heads are butting and people have their stakes in the ground. Although I feel in this case, we've heard the voices and interests and calls of Indigenous people to the table. They're at the table. And that invitation has always been there. It's just not been honored to come and sit and acknowledge. And so for me, from what you've said, the question for me that I have is, how am I sitting with the truth of my positionality in all of these conversations? Because all of these things are interconnected, whether it's here or there or somewhere else. We live in one world. And how am I seeing these interconnections and seeing whether I'm further contributing to reinforce to the harm, or working with those who have also seen that, no, we need to break this bond here. There's no such thing as being safe because we don't speak up when we need to. We have a voice for a reason.
So here are some questions to sit with this week. What's the one thing you're not saying out loud? And what would it cost you if you did? When did you last lie to keep the peace? And what did that lie cost you? If honesty is the antidote, what's stopping you from taking it?
So we started by asking, have you ever told the truth and been called dangerous? And here's what I'm sitting with after hearing Sobia's story. The answer is maybe not yet, or maybe yes, but either way, the truth isn't the danger. The silence is. What they're afraid of isn't your voice. It's what happens when we all start using it. And the times we're in right now call for us all to speak the truth.
Next time, tears that stop the conversation. Not the tender kind, the kind that becomes a weapon. We're talking about the crier in the room. Who gets to fall apart, who ends up cleaning the mess, and why the tears aren't the work. If this episode stirred something, if you're sitting with that question about what you're not saying, we've built spaces for that. Our Auntea-ology monthly gathering, the online courses, and coaching and consulting for teams and leaders who are ready to move beyond diagnosis into real transformation. We also have wonderful resources on our website, so please go check those out. If you're wanting to work on yourself, do self-awareness work, thinking about truth, radical honesty, you will find resources on our website for that. So please go check that out. Links in the show notes.
And if something we shared today landed with you, reach out. We're at info@seedroom.ca. Free discovery calls, no pitch, just a conversation about whether we can help. Thanks for pulling up a chair. Come quiet, leave louder.
Stay messy, stay curious, and stay loving.